In the library of one of the oldest and most prestigious centers of learning in the United States sits a single book that no one can read. Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, United States. It's home to the Voynich Library, one of the largest collections of rare books and manuscripts on Earth. It holds more than 1 million books, millions of manuscript pages, tens of thousands of papyri, maps, paintings, and art. But there is one book that has captured the attention and imagination of researchers, scholars, linguists, and cryptographers for over a century: the Voynich Manuscript. The Voynich Manuscript is an illustrated codex, or an ancient book made by stacking and binding sets of pages together. Yale catalogs it as Voynich MS 408 and describes it as written in an unknown script by an unknown author with no clear purpose. But here's where it gets curious. The Voynich Manuscript is not just a collection of random marks. The pages are organized. Most are even numbered. The writing is extensive, detailed, and flows in familiar lines. There are many illustrations, thorough, colorful, and apparently grouped into sections. There are pictures of what are almost certainly plants, along with astronomical or astrological diagrams and complex circular charts. There are drawings that seem to be medicinal, biological, or pharmaceutical. At first glance, it feels like a medieval scientific or medical text, but the closer you look, the more those assumptions start to fall apart. Most of the plants do not clearly match any known species. The diagrams suggest meaning, but never actually explain themselves. The writing is consistent enough to be intentional, but unreadable enough to resist translation. The Voynich Manuscript does not appear to be meaningless noise or nonsense, but it has not yet become meaningful text. The manuscript takes its modern name from Wilfrid Voynich, a rare book dealer who acquired it in 1912. But the book itself is much older. Its ownership history is incomplete, but Yale traces its story through several important hands and institutions, from associations with the court of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II on down through Jesuit scholars, who apparently held it for almost 250 years before Voynich purchased it in the early 20th century. That history matters because it tells us something important. The Voynich Manuscript did not appear out of nowhere in modern times. It has a real historical trail. There is another piece of evidence that grounds the manuscript even more firmly in the past. Radiocarbon testing of the parchment places it in the early 15th century, commonly cited between 1404 and 1438. Radiocarbon dating is powerful, but it does have limits. Medieval manuscript pages were often made from organic material, and in the Voynich manuscript's case, parchment made from animal skin. Radiocarbon dating can estimate when that animal died or when the source material stopped exchanging carbon with the environment. But it does not directly tell us the exact date of the manuscript and when it was written. And unless the ink itself has been separately tested, it does not tell us the age of the ink, the pigments, the binding, or any later additions. Parchment and leather can also be stored for some time before use, so this only gives us a rough estimate. However, researchers generally accept the manuscript coming into existence sometime in the 15th century, placing it squarely in the medieval or early Renaissance time periods. So far, we have determined that the Voynich Manuscript is a real historical document. It has an origin, or at least a parchment date, somewhere in the early 1400s, and it has a documented ownership history, although it's somewhat incomplete. However, the most interesting thing about the Voynich Manuscript is that it contains a writing system that no one has yet convincingly deciphered. The writing in the Voynich Manuscript is often called Voynichese, but just because it has a name doesn't mean we really know what it is. It's just a label for the script. To the viewer, Voynichese appears orderly. The characters repeat. The lines are arranged like text. There are word-like units separated by spaces. Some symbols appear more often than others, and some seem to occur in preferred positions. This is one reason that the manuscript is so difficult to dismiss. If it were obvious nonsense, the mystery would evaporate. But Voynichese has patterns. A 2021 computational study used topic modeling to examine the manuscript and found that computational clusters corresponded with combinations of subject matter and scribal features. What does that actually mean? It means researchers used computers to study whether the character groupings change in a pattern when the pictures or handwriting style changes. And the study found that they did. In other words, pages with plant-like illustrations tend to have one kind of word or character pattern, while pages with astronomical-like imagery have a different kind. That matters because if the writing was complete nonsense or just made up, you would expect the word-like structures to be like a kind of alphabet soup, mixed up everywhere, random on every page. But instead, the writing seems to behave more like a real book, where different sections use different kinds of words or character groupings. This, of course, does not prove that we can read the manuscript or know what the language is, but it does suggest that the writing is not meaningless gibberish. Writing, though, is only one mystery of the Voynich Manuscript. A good portion is detailed and colorful illustrations, and the hope would be that if the writing will not speak, perhaps the images will. The manuscript contains hundreds of illustrations that on first glance look familiar. Plants, roots, stars, circular diagrams and zodiac-like imagery, containers, and small human figures. Yale's detailed manuscript description divides the work into broad sections, including botanical, biological, pharmaceutical, recipe-like, astronomical or astrological, and cosmological. All of this structure seems to suggest that this is a book of knowledge, perhaps medicine or philosophy, maybe astrology, perhaps an ancient guide or journal of some kind, or a private system of classification. But the images themselves do not solve our problem. A drawing of a plant does not tell us whether the nearby text is a description, a recipe, warning, instruction, code, or something else. And when the plants themselves cannot even be reliably identified, the images become evidence of structure, but not evidence of meaning. They tell us that the book was probably organized around categories, but they do not tell us what those categories meant to the person who created it. Most explanations for the Voynich manuscript fall into a few broad categories. The first is that it contains a real, natural language. Maybe the script represents a language we know, but in an unfamiliar writing system. Maybe it records a lost or regional language. Maybe it uses abbreviations or conventions that have not survived. This explanation fits the manuscript's language-like structure, but it has a major problem. No proposed language has produced a convincing, repeatable translation. The second possibility is that the manuscript is a cipher or code. In this view, the manuscript may contain meaningful information that was deliberately encoded. That would explain why the text has structure but remains unreadable. Recent statistical work has continued to explore cipher-like properties in the manuscript, with some researchers arguing that Voynich shows structural constraints that are difficult to reproduce with simple gibberish-generating systems. But again, we have to be cautious. A cipher-like structure is not the same thing as a decipherment. To prove a cipher theory, you need more than a method that produces similar-looking text. You need a method that reliably turns the manuscript into intelligible content. In other words, the strongest proof of a cipher is a decipherment that works. And so far, we haven't seen that. The third possibility is that the manuscript is a constructed system. Not exactly a natural language and not a normal cipher, but maybe a private notation or an invented script, perhaps a symbolic system that's known only to its maker and a small community. This is attractive because it explains why the writing feels organized but does not match known languages. The problem is that a private system leaves very little outside evidence. Without a key, a related document, or a clear parallel, it's hard to move from possible to proven. The fourth possibility is that the Voynich manuscript is a hoax. Maybe it was created to look valuable or to impress a collector, but was deliberately filled with meaningless text. This theory has an obvious strength. It explains why no one can read it. But it also has a weakness. A hoax still requires motive, method, and context. It must explain the manuscript's age, length, organization, illustrations, and statistical structure. And it needs to explain why someone would invest so much effort into making a meaningless object with such elaborate internal consistency. The Voynich manuscript being a hoax is definitely possible, but just because it's unreadable does not automatically make it fake. With all these theories, why has none of them become the front runner in explaining the Voynich problem? Every major theory explains something. A real language would explain the text-like flow. A cipher would explain the secrecy and unreadability. A constructed system would explain the unfamiliar structure. And a hoax would explain the failure to translate it. But none of those theories explains everything. A successful theory has to account for the material evidence, the dating, the visual organization, the script, the statistical patterns, the lack of translation, and the historical context. That's a high bar. And the Voynich manuscript has defeated theories not because people have ignored it, but because they have studied it so intensely. The book has attracted professional attention, amateur obsession, computational analysis, linguistic study, cryptographic speculation, and historical investigation. And still, no solution has become the solution. That matters because in an investigation, a claim does not become stronger just because it is interesting. It becomes stronger when it explains the evidence better than the alternatives. And so far, no explanation or theory has managed to do that. So what do we actually know? What can we say with confidence? We can say that the Voynich manuscript is a real illustrated manuscript held at Yale University as Beinecke MS 408. We can say that its parchment dates to the early 15th century. We can say that it contains an unknown script, an unknown language or writing system, and illustrations that appear organized into thematic sections. We can say that it has not been conclusively deciphered. We can say that some evidence points toward structure and possible meaning. And we can say, most importantly, that every confident solution should be treated carefully, unless it can produce a repeatable, evidence-based reading of the text. That's not as dramatic as saying the mystery has been solved, but it is much more honest. Why does the Voynich Manuscript matter? It matters because it forces us to think clearly about uncertainty. It is tempting to treat every mystery as a puzzle with a hidden answer waiting just off screen. But historical evidence does not always work that way. Sometimes the object survives, but the context disappears. Sometimes the writing remains, but the language is gone. Sometimes there is enough evidence to rule out bad answers, but not enough to prove a good one. The Voynich Manuscript teaches us the difference between a possibility and a conclusion. It teaches us that patterns are not automatically meaning, that mystery is not permission to invent, that not knowing is not the same as knowing nothing. Maybe that's why this book remains so compelling, not because it lets us say whatever we want, but because it refuses to let us say more than we know. So in closing, is the Voynich Manuscript a lost text, a code, or an elaborate fake? The honest answer? We just don't know. It may contain meaningful writing, it may be encoded, it may represent a private system, it may even be an extraordinary act of deception. But the strongest conclusion is not a solution. It is a boundary. The Voynich Manuscript is a real 15th century object filled with organized images and an undeciphered script, whose purpose, author, language, and meaning still remain unknown. And after more than a century of theories, that is still where the evidence leaves us, with a book no one can read. Not because no one has tried, but because the past does not always give up its secrets just because we ask better questions. Sometimes the most important thing an investigation can do is not solve the mystery. Sometimes it is to show us exactly where knowledge ends and curiosity begins.